It was supposed to stay secret. The pardon was granted in February. No press release, no announcement, no public statement, just a quiet decision buried in a ministry dossier that would have stayed buried if a newspaper hadn't found it. And when Il Fatto Quotidiano published what it had found, the story that emerged was not just about a pardon, it was about Berlusconi, about Bunga, about a woman at the centre of one of the most scandalous chapters in modern Italian political history. And it was about a justice minister who recommended clemency, without checking whether the story he was told was even true. This is the story of the secret pardon that has now become Giorgia Meloni's problem, and the 4 words she said today that may not be enough to make it go away. Nicole Minetti. If you followed Italian politics in the 2000s, you know that name. She was a dental hygienist who treated Silvio Berlusconi after he was physically attacked at a rally in Milan in 2009. Berlusconi thanked her by nominating her for election to the Lombardy Regional Council. And then she became central to one of the most infamous investigations in Italian political history, Bunga, the sex party scandal that defined Berlusconi's final years in power. In 2019, Minetti was sentenced to 2 years and 10 months in prison for procuring sex workers for Berlusconi's parties. 2 years later, an additional 13-month sentence for misuse of public funds. The combined term was under 4 years, which meant, under Italian law, she avoided prison entirely. But she was required to carry out community service. Then, in late 2025, Minetti filed an appeal for a presidential pardon. Her argument was humanitarian. She had adopted a child with serious health problems, she said. A child who required continuous medical treatment, a child she could not leave. The Justice Ministry reviewed the file. Minister Carlo Nordio recommended clemency. President Sergio Mattarella signed the pardon in February 2026, and nobody said a word. Until this month. Il Fatto Quotidiano, Italy's leading investigative newspaper, published a report. The report raised questions about the humanitarian claims at the centre of Minetti's appeal, alleged inconsistencies in the case, questions about the adoption of the child described as having serious health problems, questions about whether the details provided by Minetti had ever been verified. Then came the detail that changed everything. Italian newspapers reported that when magistrates reviewed the initial plea for clemency, they did not ask for confirmation from Uruguay about the various details Minetti had provided. Uruguay, the country where, apparently, key elements of Minetti's humanitarian case were based. Nobody checked. Mattarella responded with a step that is almost without precedent in Italian institutional life. He publicly urged the Justice Ministry to review the case. The President of the Republic, the man who had signed the pardon, was now calling for an investigation into how that pardon had been recommended to him. That is not a normal event in Italian politics. That is a president who feels he was given incomplete information, and who is making sure everyone knows it. Today, April 28th, the Milan Prosecutor General's office announced it had launched urgent inquiries through Interpol. They called the allegations very serious. They said they were seeking information from abroad. And they said that once their checks were complete, they could revise their original recommendation for the pardon. In other words, the pardon may be reversed. The opposition moved immediately. They called for the resignation of Justice Minister Carlo Nordio. The Democratic Party said Nordio had either failed to check the facts or had chosen not to. Either answer, they said, was disqualifying. And then Meloni spoke. I have confidence in Minister Carlo Nordio. 4 words. She said the clemency process had followed the law. She ruled out Nordio's resignation, as of today. But she added, the case warrants further review, as of today. 3 words that sound like confidence. 3 words that sound like a door being left open. In Italian political language, as of today is not reassurance. It is a countdown. Now here is the detail that connects this story to something much larger. Carlo Nordio was not a random appointment. He was Meloni's flagship justice minister. A former magistrate himself, a prosecutor who had spent decades inside Italy's legal system, she appointed him specifically because she wanted a credible, independent figure at the head of Italy's justice ministry. Someone who could push her judicial reform agenda. Someone who could credibly argue that Meloni's government respected the rule of law. That argument just got significantly harder to make. Because the pardon scandal is not just about Nicole Minetti, it is about a process. A presidential pardon in Italy follows a specific chain. The convicted person applies. The Justice Ministry reviews the file. The ministry makes a recommendation to the president. The president decides. At every stage there are checks. At every stage there is an obligation to verify the facts. The Milan magistrates did not verify the facts from Uruguay. The Justice Ministry recommended clemency based on a file that may have contained false information. The president signed a pardon that he now wants reviewed. Every link in the chain failed, and now Interpol is involved. There is one more layer to this story that Italy's political class is not saying out loud. Berlusconi died in June 2023, but his shadow over Italian politics has never fully lifted. Forza Italia, the party he founded, is part of Meloni's coalition. Antonio Tajani, Berlusconi's political heir, is Italy's foreign minister. Nicole Minetti was a Berlusconi loyalist, a figure from the Bunga era. A name that, for most Italians, is inseparable from the worst of the Berlusconi years. And now she has a pardon. Recommended by Meloni's justice minister, signed by Mattarella, based on a file that nobody verified. Meloni did not grant this pardon, but she is defending the minister who recommended it. And that defence, however carefully worded, places her inside the story. In Italian politics, loyalty to a minister under pressure is not a neutral act. It is a statement. It says, I am willing to stand here, even as Interpol opens inquiries, even as Mattarella publicly calls for a review, even as the opposition demands a resignation. Meloni has done this before. When Santanchè was under investigation, Meloni protected her for months. She said she trusted the judicial process. She said no one should resign before being found guilty. She held that position until the evidence made it untenable, and then Santanchè resigned. The question now is whether Nordio follows the same pattern. Trust, review, wait, and then, quietly, exit. Nordio's situation is different from Santanchè's in one important way. Santanchè was accused of personal wrongdoing. Nordio is accused of institutional failure, of running a justice ministry that recommended a pardon without verifying the facts. That is not a personal corruption charge. That is a competence charge. And in some ways, a competence charge is harder to defend, because you cannot say the courts will decide. The courts are already involved. Interpol is already involved. Mattarella is already on record. The facts are being checked right now. If the checks confirm that Minetti provided false information and that nobody in the Justice Ministry bothered to verify it, then the story changes completely. It is no longer a pardon scandal. It becomes a question of whether Italy's Justice Ministry was negligent or whether it chose not to look too closely at a file connected to Berlusconi's world. That distinction matters enormously in Italian politics. The first is a bureaucratic failure. The second is a political one. And the opposition will spend the next 16 months making sure Italian voters understand the difference. She has survived Trump. She has survived Solovyov. She has survived Mattarella's security decree standoff. But the Berlusconi shadow is different. It does not come from outside. It comes from inside the coalition she leads. And it comes with a name that every Italian over 40 remembers. Bunga. The file was supposed to stay secret. It didn't. Subscribe to The Record Room, because the next file is already open.